When I first approached law and neuroscience 8 years ago, I still remember that the first papers that I was reading were essentially claiming that by showing that the mind is just a shadow of the brain, neuroscience would eventually lead to the death of the person in the law. This claim still looms large in neurolegal discussion, but I actually never found it so compelling. Over the years, I worked on the hypothesis that neuroscience can actually make criminal law and justice more human and humane. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to present an alternative model of punishment that is informed by insights from social and affective neuroscience into the role of emotions and social influences in pro-social behavior. This talk is largely representative of the work that I have been doing as a PSSN scholar and basically explains why and how this body of neuroscientific evidence can be used as foundational evidence to lend support to responses to crime that hinge on inclusion as well as social and emotional support, and in particular to lend support to the tenets of restorative justice and ultimately to suggest the inclusion of restorative justice values in conventional punitive models. The potential outcome of this work for the legal domain is manifold. It ranges from contributing to legal literature to even informing criminal justice policies and legislative proposals. I'm going to begin my talk with illustrating the conventional model of rule-breaking that underpins current justifications for punishment. I shall then contrast this model of rule-breaking with a body of neuroscientific and behavioral literature that suggests the pivotal roles that emotions and emotions-related skills, coupled with social and environmental influences, play in prosocial behavior. I shall then apply this body of neuroscientific knowledge to an alternative justice approach that is restorative justice. And I shall suggest that this body of knowledge actually lends support to the accuracy of the tenets of restorative justice, which means that restorative justice may be a more accurate way of addressing wrongdoing. And based on this comparison, based on this application, I will provide an alternative model of punishment that hinges on this body of empirical claims, and I will analyze its practical implication. And I shall conclude with some observations and suggestions for future research. So within contemporary penal philosophy, there is general consensus on the view that individuals are morally and legally responsible and get punished for their misbehavior because they are capable of moral agency. In the eyes of criminal law, individuals are capable of moral agency when they know what they're doing and they know that what they're doing is wrong, and yet they choose to act unlawfully. This legal understanding of moral agency that grounds a finding of criminal responsibility and justifies the infliction of punishment essentially encompasses two components: knowledge and choice, that in legal jargon are better known as cognition and volition. So this legal understanding of the capacity for moral agency is the ground of our current justifications for punishment: retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. So the narrative that cuts across these four justifications for punishment is perfectly in line with the substance of the legal notion of moral agency. So essentially, the state inflicts punishment upon an individual, not only because the individual deserves to be punished in proportion to the seriousness of the offense that he or she committed, but also because through punishment, the individual will understand the negative consequences of his or her misbehavior and will choose to act lawfully in the future. However, the infliction of punishment, as you can read, also entails a number of other consequences that include the moral and social exclusion of the individual and the social isolation of the individual for the rest of the community. And the paradox is that, in so doing, the state also presumes that through the infliction of harm, through moral and social exclusion, and through social isolation, the individual will also self-reform and self-rehabilitate, and he will get back to society as a law-abiding citizen. These claims are most evident in current punitive practices, and I have used incarceration as the most emblematic example. So there are many different kinds of incarceration, from minimum security to maximum security facilities with more or less restrictive isolating policies. However, the narrative behind incarceration is always the same. That is, through the pain of incarceration, people will get what they deserve and will also understand the wrongfulness of their misbehavior and will refrain from reoffending in the future. However, the result of this narrative is that people get morally and socially excluded, they get separated from the rest of the society, and often in dehumanizing conditions. And this applies equally to people belonging to the healthy and unhealthy population. However, official statistics report a 70% of recidivism rates in this country, which means that there is something profoundly wrong with the system, as people that get incarcerated tend to re-engage in wrongdoing. As you could notice in my discourse about moral agency and punishment, I have not mentioned anything about emotions and social factors. So the social-emotional dimension of perpetrators that may have a link with the crime is not considered in the essential substance of the legal notion of moral responsibility, and emotions and social factors that have a link with the crime, with few exceptions, are not part of the essential, let's say, substance of the culpability notions like mens rea or legal insanity. However, emotions and social factors may play a circumstantial role at sentencing as either mitigating or aggravating circumstances that may increase or decrease penalties. And even more importantly, the social-emotional dimension of perpetrators is not addressed during the execution of punishment, where more punitive mechanisms prevail over the social-emotional needs of the people who are incarcerated. So while this approach to crime is certainly able to rationalize the infliction of punishment upon a perpetrator, limitations to the relevance of emotions and social influences in addressing wrongdoing have proven to be ineffective. And these shortcomings are most evident when they are confronted with the body of empirical research, and specifically from neuroscientific research, about the pivotal role that emotions and social influences play in moral and social behavior. So today there is unanimous, or mostly unanimous, consensus across behavioral and neuroscientific disciplines that emotions and emotions-related skills play a number of pivotal functions in moral and social behavior. Neuroscientific studies have suggested the extensive recruitment of specific brain regions, both cortical and subcortical, emotion-related brain regions in decision-making processes, moral judgments, and social cognition. And importantly, this body of study lends support to perspectives in psychology that suggest that the way in which individuals cope with social demands in adaptive and morally acceptable ways is also influenced by the experience of specific emotions, and particularly social emotions like regret or compassion, or specific emotion-related skills like empathy and emotion regulation. Clearly, the relationship between the social-emotional brain and social and moral behavior is not directly balanced, but is largely influenced by the environment. So research suggests that social environment particularly influences neurological and physiological reactions, which means that the way in which individuals react to salient stimuli with certain emotional reactions depends on a variety of external variables that include personal background, personal history, social background, and also the surrounding environment. Research has also suggested that there are specific factors, social and environmental factors like good child rearing or high socioeconomic status or positive attachment that contribute to the normal development and functioning of a variety of brain areas, including the brain areas that support the specific social-emotional functions that are involved in moral and social behavior. On the other hand, the absence or the breakdown of these factors, in addition to the experience of traumatic life events like chronic exposure to violence or emotional neglect or physical abuse, appear to compromise the normal development and the functioning of these very same brain regions, with negative effects in terms of maladaptive action tendencies, psychological symptoms, and let's say behavioral dysfunctions, including the risk of engaging in antisocial conduct, especially characterized by aggression and violence. However, the good news is that one of the key insights emerging from neuroscientific research concerns the plasticity of the brain. That is, the brain keeps changing, and it keeps changing throughout the entire lifespan, although there may be key times in its development like childhood and adolescence. And it changes in response to new stimuli and changing environments. Research on plasticity has also suggested the plasticity of the brain regions that are involved in the experience and the processing of specific emotions and emotion-related skills. For instance, some studies have suggested structural and functional changes in a variety of brain regions from medial orbitofrontal cortex, the striatum, the amygdala, following compassion training, empathy training, and mindfulness. And activity, changing in the activity in these brain regions has been associated with increased levels of emotional regulation, increased level of empathic responding, and of emotional resilience. And these studies correlate with the body of behavioral studies that show that this kind of training imply positive behavioral effects in terms of decreased levels of aggression and violence. And these studies have also been done in incarcerated population. Other studies in brain plasticity have focused on the importance of social relationships, of positive social relationships and social environments in shaping the brain. These studies have been done mostly in animal models and mostly in mice, but have basically shown that mice that are reared in socially rich environments and surrounded by their peers exhibit normal functioning and activity in the brain regions that are involved in sociable tendencies. This very same body of studies has also analyzed the negative effects of growing up and living in social isolation and sensory deprivation, and have suggested a number of negative effects, negative changes, both structure and function of a variety of brain regions supporting different functions, with a number of psychological adverse effects like chronic anxiety, depression, poor regulation of social behavior and detachment from the environment, and social emotional pain. And even more importantly, these studies have suggested that a period in isolation, even a short one for a few days, may imply long-lasting effects also upon reintroduction to the social environment, which means that living in social isolation and sensory in deprived environments can have potentially permanent effects. And I would like to point out here that very recently a number of neurolegal scholars, and I would like to include myself, have started using this body of knowledge to challenge solitary confinement. Clearly, these studies have been done on animal models, but there is general agreement that the way in which the mice brain works shares similarities with the human brain, and actually the human brain is even more sociable than the mice brain, which means that living in solitary confinement in deprived conditions may have even more severe effects on individuals. Okay, so this body of neuroscientific knowledge that I have briefly reported entails a number of interesting information for criminal justice. First, it suggests that the legal view of moral agency, that is why individuals make choices in relation to wrongdoing, is somehow too abstract and incomplete. Second, it suggests that moral agency is not something static that either exists or does not exist, but it can change, and it can change for the better, as long as there are the right stimuli and positive environments. And third, it suggests that challenging behavior with isolation and exclusion risks to, let's say, imply a number of neurobiological deficits that may be particularly risky for mental health and social functioning. On the other hand, and I get to the main point of my presentation, this body of evidence seems to lend support to restorative justice. For those who are not familiar with legal terminology, restorative justice is an alternative justice approach or an alternative theory of justice that aims at reconciliating the perpetrator with the victim and the community, as well as repairing the harm done by crime. Unlike criminal justice, restorative justice does not adopt a punitive approach to crime and rejects challenging wrongdoing with exclusion and isolation, but rather it hinges on values like personal accountability, empowerment, support, and acceptance. And it endorses dialogue and cooperation between the parties that are touched by the crime in order to find constructive solutions to repair the damage caused by the crime. Interestingly, some studies from Europe have shown that restorative justice is positively linked with crime desistance, which means that when perpetrators get involved in restorative justice processes, they feel more motivated to stop engaging in criminal behavior. The only problem about restorative justice is that a purely restorative justice system implies significant threats to specific due process rights, because restorative justice processes require a prior admission of guilt on the part of the perpetrator, which clearly implies some threats to the privilege against self-incrimination, right to stay silent, or presumption of innocence, and the right to counsel is not always provided. However, what is most important for this talk is the view of moral agency that is endorsed by restorative justice. So first, restorative justice endorses the view that moral character is dynamic, that people can change and they can change for the better, that everybody is capable of good and bad things as long as there is let's say, they are motivated to change. So importantly, restorative justice also endorses a separation between the act and the person. That is, we can definitely blame the act and disapprove the act. However, when we disapprove the act, we should not also humiliate and disintegrate the person, which is exactly what the criminal justice system does. However, restorative justice is also conscious that for a person to change, change does not occur on its own, but there must be some motivation and support on the part of the other individuals. So it acknowledges that individuals are hubs of relationship, that individuals have to be connected to one another and to support each other. And thanks to this sense of belongingness, people feel more motivated to act pro-socially towards other individuals. And last, restorative justice is strongly embedded in the view that emotions are powerful catalyzers for healing and for moral engagement. So when the parties involved in the crime, the victim, the perpetrator, and community members get together in the same room and discuss and talk to each other about what happened with the crime, there is a lot of emotional exchange going on, which means that there is a lot of empathy going on, and so people re-engage with each other. Clearly, restorative justice does not mean that it works for everybody, but literature shows that there are very high chances that after going through restorative justice processes, the perpetrator feels more motivated to take personal accountability for the crime that he or she has committed, feel motivated to change for the better, and to act to make amends. Okay, to put it in neuroscientific terms, as a British neuroscientist framed it, restorative justice processes are emotionally draining circumstances that provide positive stimulation for the brain areas involved in morality. Moreover, they increase chances of neuroplasticity, blah, 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 blah. And if these processes are integrated by rehabilitation and support, individuals can actually undergo profound change on both behavioral and neurobiological levels. So it is interesting to notice that there is a clear contrast between the model of the homo egocentricus and economicus that is endorsed by criminal justice and the homo socialis and empathicus that is endorsed by restorative justice. And as I have reported in this table, the body of neuroscientific and also psychological knowledge about moral and social behavior clearly lends more support to the tenets of restorative justice. Now you may say, okay, let's get rid of criminal justice and replace it with restorative justice. Things are not so simple because, as I mentioned before, restorative justice poses significant threats to specific due process rights, and also because the fact that neuroscience or any other empirical science lends support to a justice approach rather than another does not mean that the legal system must adopt the justice approach. So the choice for a justice approach is a pure criminal political matter that only the legal system can decide, and where empirical knowledge can have just a limited role. So the most difficult task in this case for a legal scholar or an aspiring legal scholar is that of trying to make sense of this empirical information in a normatively plausible way. That is, to accommodate this body of scientific information in a normatively plausible framework. So by applying what I have discussed in the current model of punishment, I have developed this model of punishment. Okay. So first, I have revised the legal notion of moral agency. So I have filled the gap between cognition and volition with also the emotions and the social influences that move an individual to engage in a given choice. And second, I have enriched the notion of moral agency as something that is holistic and dynamic, because our moral agency is something that is multidimensional. It is not simply one-dimensional. And it is dynamic because, as I have discussed before, people's morality can change and can change for the better. This clearly does not imply a denial of the concept of criminal responsibility. We can still aim to hold people criminally responsible, although this body of knowledge can also imply a change in the confines of criminal responsibility, which is the other part of my project, so I'm not going to touch that today. But still, the way we challenge people who are found criminally responsible does not necessarily mean that this has to entail isolation, exclusion, and suffering. So here I got to the point, to the core point of my model of punishment, that is restorative punishment. As you can see, I have not touched the current justifications for punishment. They are exactly where they are. So the criminal justice system still aims to retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. However, what I have done, I have just replaced the most punitive, isolating, and exclusionary aspects of each theory of punishment, and I have replaced it with restorative justice values of inclusion, support, and acceptance. Not only is this model of punishment in line with a more accurate understanding of moral agency, but it also solves the paradox of rehabilitation, because the ethos that cuts across all justifications for punishment truly guarantees that the perpetrator is more likely to reintegrate into society. So this kind of theoretical framework can have a number of practical implications that actually already exist in many places in the rest of the world. So, for instance, one implication could be suggesting restorative justice as an alternative dispute resolution at any stage of criminal proceedings, as long as there is consent, both on the victim, on the part of the victim and the perpetrator. To even revising sentencing criteria to give more weight to protective factors, to even suggesting the implementation of more restorative justice-based community sentences, to enriching custodial environments and the ethos inside of correctional facilities, to even abolishing solitary confinement. So, to conclude, I shall go back to my initial point. Can neuroscience make criminal justice more human and humane? I think it can. It can do that in a more indirect way, though, by educating the law and the public about the importance of emotions and social relationships in promoting positive behavioral change, as well as by suggesting a different narrative of wrongdoing that may lead to dealing with crime in more humane ways. However, more empirical and cross-disciplinary evidence is needed. There is already some work going on, so I hope that in my future talks I will be able to speak more about that. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank all the people that work with me, the PSSN program, Center for Science and Society, my colleagues, my mentors, my amazing people of the Center for Justice, and thank you all. Okay.